kein Misstrauen, einfach nur so. Welche Folie?
Es könnte vielleicht nochmal ein bisschen hier und da ein bisschen ruckeln, weil das halt jetzt erst aber eigentlich, ja. Ist das wohl alles sehr selbsterklärend, wurde mir auch gerade gesagt. Also einfach hier hin und her und dann, ja. Da ist keiner online. Ich werde noch mal kurz sagen. Da ist keiner online, das war eine Workshop-Session. Die Workshop-Session das heißt, wir sind eigentlich nur hier im Raum plus Brian und mir und Jan Ming, Tria, bei Tria, Seite und Brian Seite auch. Also die beiden sind dann.
Sie können auch nicht ablesen.
Ja, okay. Genau. Die sind dann dabei, ja, aber sonst außerhalb dieses Environment ist dann nicht.
Alles klar, danke.
Ja, das macht ja gar nichts. Nee.
Ich mache es nicht an.
Ja.
Aber das hier?
Das ist nicht meine... Ach, das ist meine Präsentation. Ah, okay, da wurde das Layout nur verändert. Ich verstehe.
Also das ist die richtige. Nicht?
Nee. Das ist jetzt nicht so... Nee, ich hatte noch eine andere.
Okay.
Ah ja.
Okay.
Ja.
Das ist aber ein PDF.
Ja.
Das ist toll. Ich brauche die PowerPoint, glaube ich. Ich habe nämlich jetzt das nur mit der PowerPoint. Ich weiß nicht, wie man das in Vorbild macht.
View geht auf jeden Fall und dann Fullscreen Mode.
Funktioniert das so für Sie?
Ja, klar.
Also ich werde das jetzt gleich...
Ja, nee, das reicht mir.
Okay. Okay, wollen Sie schon anfangen?
Ja.
Okay, Entschuldigung.
Ja. Können Sie das dann einmal darauf ziehen, dass wir das sehen und dann... Das ist ja nicht so schlimm, weil ja eh keiner online ist. Wir sind ja eh nur hier. Also, das ist ja, und zur Not muss halt wer nach vorne kommen. Ja. Und Sie machen das an, ne? Ja, okay.
Hello. Yeah. Yeah. Great. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. I think we are supposed to start, or we should start, because we are already a couple of minutes late. And yeah, bus told us to start on time, so let's try and stick to the schedule. There are some slides that I'm waiting on to be pulled up that are still not here, but that doesn't really matter. My name is Lena Reimann, and this is Chris Ebai. We co-organize the session, and we are hosting the session, which is on the synthesis and communication of climate change risks in scientific assessments. And unfortunately, Brian O'Neill couldn't be here, who was the, I guess, driving force behind organizing the session. So that's very sad, but that's the way it is. So, okay, yeah. So, yeah, and Jan Mings, who is the first presenter today, he will also do his presentation online, but he will be here, but just with us online. And I had two slides where I was basically going to introduce the logistics of the session and also the 5 presentations that we are going to see. And let me try and remember what it says on the slides. So the idea of the session, because this is a workshop session, we wanted to have as much time for discussion after the presentations as possible. We allocated 10 minutes of presentations to each of the presenters. We have 5 presentations, so 10 minutes each, plus 2 minutes for pressing questions. So whenever you don't understand something, or there's something that you really need to be that needs to be answered right after the presentations, please go ahead and do so. Otherwise, we will have a longer discussion after all 5 presentations, and if everything goes well, we should have around 20 minutes or a good 20 minutes for a more in-depth discussion after the presentations. And okay. Yeah. Okay. No, I don't. But it doesn't really matter. No, I don't. No, but that's fine. But what I was going to say is that I think the way it was scheduled, I think the way or the slot that this session got was well chosen this way, because the beginning plenary sessions already touched upon some of the issues that we want to discuss a bit further in the session, which is about why, for example, in Working Group 2 of the IPCC report, there was not a very structured, I think that was what was said in the morning, not a very structured way of integrating scenarios. And yeah, so this is, I think, the starting point or the motivation behind doing the session. And Chris, do you have anything to add before we start with the presentations? No. So we will start with the first presentation will be Jan, who is online. And then we will continue with Hans Martin and Veruska, and after that, followed by Carl and Brian, will do the last presentation. Okay. Thank you. So in the initial program, and then we rearranged the speakers, but it's fine. But let's first. And yeah, okay. While there's still some technical things taken care of, actually we had come up with 5 questions that we wanted to discuss or go along with you in the session. And those questions I had planned to show you just before we start the presentations. And I do not, from the top of my head, recall what these questions or exactly the framing of those questions. Nice. Okay, this is my introductory. Okay, let's go directly to the questions then. So these are the questions that I would like, or that we would like you to have in mind while you listen to presentations, and we can go along those, discussing those after the presentations. Of course, we can also discuss other things, but this is maybe a good starting point to go along. So let me just maybe read them out. I don't have them here on the screen, so it's a bit awkward. But so the first one, and this is also not in a specific order. How well is the scenario framework currently working for synthesizing and communicating climate change risks? For example, in the context of the IPCC assessments, but also other assessments. And how can we increase the use and uptake, specifically of socioeconomic scenarios? I will leave it at that, I think. And and are there improvements to existing scenarios that would help? Then the third question, what are the strengths and weaknesses of scenario-based approaches? As compared to other approaches, including those based on global warming levels, such as the reasons for concern. We will talk about those a bit more. And how can we improve scenario-based approaches? And what could be also potentially new approaches to synthesizing and communicating scenario-based work. So, why? Please keep those in mind, and then we will get back to those later after the presentations. Thank you. And now we should have a presentation of Jans. Otherwise, if it's easier, we could also start with one other one. Here. Jan, we can't hear you yet.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we don't see your slides yet.
Okay, I have them on and I have shared them, so I don't know what the problem is. It's not on my end. Can you see them? I'm in presentation mode. So please let me know when I can start, because I don't see what you see.
It's the first set of parallel sessions, so I...
Yeah, this looks good. Okay, can you see that now?
Yes, we see everything.
Excellent. So this talk is on using AI for synthesizing evidence, and evidence that is vast and fast growing. And this is a talk that is inspired by work I've been doing with people from climate analytics. So Carl was deeply involved, and other people also from NCC and climate analytics. Let me start with the background. So we are living in what we call the age of big literature. So we have vast literature on climate change, and it's fast growing. And just to give you an idea, so in 2020 there were about almost 60,000 studies on climate change. And that is more than the literature, much more than the literature available for the first 3 IPCC assessment cycles. And this is kind of gives us an idea what we are really up against. In the 6th assessment cycle, and here we only show literature from the Web of Science, we had about 370,000 studies, on climate change, but if we make a back of the envelope calculation of the literature during AR6, it will be around 900,000, we estimate. So, and there is on top a vast literature that is just climate relevant. Here we were focusing on studies that really explicitly talk about climate change. So the literature is vast, and as you can see, this curve is fast growing. And we therefore argue that we need a new focus on synthesis and develop actually methods that can process this amount of information. And this is what we are trying to provide here. Why do we need to do this? In this slide, you can see that the IPCC has done actually a great job in, trying to keep up with this vast growth of publication. The right bars are the citations in IPCC assessment. They have been growing quite substantially during the first 5 assessment cycles, but the literature has simply developed more rapidly, and therefore, if we have a share, if we do the share of cited publications over new publications over that cycle, then we can see that we have a declining fraction. And this is something that we need to be worried about, because it's potentially we are increasingly dealing with selection bias. And we also, in the IPCC, when we basically summarize evidence, we like to do this in those maps. And here you can see a famous evidence map on attributable climate impacts, and we know that they are hugely controversial. So in the approval session, there was a lot of discussion: is this really all the evidence that there is? And then as authors, we often answer, yeah, this is the main literature that we can find. And but we are not. So I'm not convinced of this. I think there is much more, and it's so much that we really have difficulties in tracking it. And I think we need to have new approaches that actually give us an idea, in terms of how well we cover the literature and what maybe the uncertainty is regards to the coverage of the literature. 2 points that we are going to make. I will give a little case study where we've tried to take a different approach to basically the same map. And we did 2 things. So we brought together model-based grid cell level attribution of precipitation and warming trends as one line of evidence. And then we went out and systematically searched using natural language processing approaches and the scientific literature in terms of their climate drivers and their climate impacts. And then the idea was that we could bring those 2 together to actually provide a map of attributable climate impact that is that might be more comprehensive, and also quantify the uncertainties. And this is now only an idea of the left-hand part, so the natural language processing part. So how much literature actually talks about climate impacts in some way, so in terms of observational studies, so not ex ante, only ex post. And we found about 100,000 studies, and we developed an automated pipeline for identifying and classifying those impacts, including the uncertainty. So you can see the total number of studies in the top panel, and in the lower panel you see the type of climate impacts that we could estimate, and also the continent where they take place, again with the uncertainty bars. And how we did this was to actually label a lot of abstracts and basically use this to train an algorithm to reproduce our judgment. And we could do this with a reasonable certainty. And then basically we could map out at a grid cell level, because we did entity recognition approaches that allowed us to identify the literature at the most granular level and pull this together at the grid cell level, which we then could bring together with the evidence from the models to really see whether or not the documented impacts that you see on this map are actually also taking place in areas that can be attributed to climate change. And this is then how results look. And what we find at the very high level is that about 80% of the land surface, or 80% of the land surface, we have attributable climate and documented climate impacts. And in this area, about 85% of the population lives. And we could also identify an attribution gap that highlighted that the distribution of evidence is not necessarily coinciding with the location where the climate has really changed, and that we have really less evidence in low-income countries, which is, I think, important looking ahead. We believe that a similar approach can also be applied to the scenarios literature, and we really have great modeling intercomparison initiatives that are mainly responsible for much of the progress that has been made within the IPCC. But there's also tons of local and regional evidence on climate risks and energy and land transitions that are not really covered in the same way, and maybe a similar approach as we've taken here for the attribution of climate impacts could also be really helpful to have at least a more comprehensive mapping of the literature. So we could use similar AI-based approaches to collect and synthesize this evidence in key dimensions and augment the output from global models with more specific information. Similarly, we could collect and classify different forms of evidence on future climate risks and layer it on top of global model outputs. So these are kind of different ways, but I think it would be an important step to basically deepen the already excellent work on scenarios that has really been the backbone, from my perspective, of IPCC assessments, and try to cover the available literature much more comprehensively. And in the use of time, I've taken out a slide to be a little bit shorter so that we can make sufficient progress in the program. Thanks so much.
Jan, can you hear me when I talk to you like this?
Did you talk to me? I can hear very badly.
Yeah, Jan, thank you very much for your presentation. I was just trying to shout from the audience whether you can hear me, but apparently you can't. Are there any questions that you would like to ask Jan based on his presentation? I think you will have to come to the front and ask the question here at the microphone. And also, I don't know whether Jan will see you, so maybe you could introduce yourself then.
Okay, hi Jan, I'm Christian Huckel, Zurich. I think it's a really great approach and effort, and I think this will be very important for the next IPCC cycle. And interesting to see results, but I'm really skeptical about the attribution, whether attribution is the right play field for that. I've been part of the chapter team that has produced the map AR5, and one of the reasons why not all regions were covered was because many of these studies were just not rigorous enough in terms of attribution, and I cannot imagine how you can do that now and in the near future with an AI algorithm, because you have to go to in-depth to these studies to see whether this is actually really a climate impact or maybe other non-climatic factors. Can you elaborate a little bit on how I cannot see an AI attribution algorithm so far, but I'm interested to learn. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for this question. And indeed, this is also the thing that we have been grappling with. And so I would agree with your statement if we would have only used the AI part. But if you remember back to the presentations, there are two parts. One is this classification approach that comes from our NLP approach, but then we brought that together with actually grid cell-based attribution from models, right? It's basically the Knudsen approach to attribution, and we did this for warming and precipitation, and then basically we brought this evidence together with the other evidence, so with the classified NLP-based impacts. And so we cannot actually say indeed for each of these classified impacts whether or not they do attribution or not. But what we then do is to see, are they actually taking place are they relating to a driver that can be attributed to climate change, so warming or precipitation, and is it taking place in a grid cell where this attribution can be done? And then, if you have a study that is happening in a grid cell, say, where warming can be attributed, and this is an impact that is described related to warming, then we would say it's still, this is a study that also documents an impact. And it's a different logic, but I think it's an interesting alternative approach.
Hey, Jan, it's Chris Ebi. And I've got a similar kind of question, but a follow-up of, can you use AI to start setting parameters, for example, that the impact study has to be more than 5 years, that you can look at the years in which you've looked at this quote-unquote attribution, but you can match it then with the climate data so that you know that you're actually doing the same temporal scale as well as the geographic scale, and how to use AI to start weeding out the large number of studies that claim attribution when, in fact, they couldn't possibly.
Thanks, Chris. Great to hear you. It would have been even nicer to see you in person, to meet you in person. As I said before, like the attribution is model-based, and we just then basically show studies that relate to activity, say warming in a particular grid cell, and having this as a driver. In terms of the temporal alignment, this is actually something that we could do but haven't actually done in that study, to really take the information that we actually have on time and really say whether or not, say, a model may attribute in a grid cell to warming only from 2001, and the study is basically relating to the 90s. This is something that we wouldn't have covered at this moment, but this is something that we can do and are actually keen to address in the future. But the idea is indeed that we fully agree that basically it's not about classifying whether attribution is done at an abstract level, but rather pulling together in what we think an interesting way, this kind of the whole universe of studies that are discussing impacts in different ways with the related literature on the actual attribution, and that might be an alternative way of thinking about it.
Hi Jan, this is Yuri Rogel. I have a question. I was intrigued by your last slide where you suggest you can do this for scenario-based literature. And I just wanted you to ask to elaborate a bit on how you would go about kind of avoiding just replicating biases that are there in the literature. We've both worked on a paper where we looked at the CDR potential or requirements in the literature. By now there are papers out there that don't use that much CDR as in the literature that was available then. How would you make sure that is there a way that your method can account for this, or how would you go about doing that?
I mean, thinking about future scenarios is a bit different because we have here this, exposed attribution in some sense, and that's easier to grapple with. And what we are at the moment only saying in that study is whether or not, something. We are not saying anything about scale. We are just saying, this is an impact that is happening in a grid cell where, say, warming can be attributed to climate change, and this impact is warming related. So this is what we can say. Of course, it gets much more complicated if you think about scenarios and then also about scale, as you say, scale the volumes of CDR or something like this. I mean, I would, and also in terms of the biases in the literature, that's a real tricky one then to deal with. I mean, I would start really very modestly and say, and just maybe start pulling out information that we have from more granular models or models that are typically not covered in IPCC assessment and see what they say, for example, about side effects. If we want to learn about side effects of, say, CDR deployment, bioenergy deployment, maybe, and then, the literature that is a bit more granular is really interesting. And if we can pull this up very systematically, maybe that gives us a better idea of local conditioning. But I don't have a master plan for this, and would rather invite anybody who is interested to get in touch and think about this jointly.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jan, also for proposing this very interesting idea that I guess can be elaborated on more in the next couple of years. And let's move on to the next speaker, which is Hans-Martin Fissel from the European Environment Agency.
Oops. Thank you. How can I see my presentation? Okay. Well, good afternoon. And now for something completely different. There was no artificial intelligence involved in the preparation of this presentation. For the rest, I leave it to your judgment. I can't see my Oh, no. Okay. So then I'll just, in the interest of time, start and trusting that the slides will come out. So I wanted to talk about the scenario use in European climate hazard impact and risk assessments. And I will cover both past assessments, but also a planned one, which is where I'm particularly interested in your feedback. And just to say, this is an international audience. So I'm working with the European Environment Agency. So this is an agency of the European Union. So we're not a research institution. We are at the science policy interface. Our task is to provide independent information on the environment, and that includes climate change. And we are based in Copenhagen in Denmark. So at some point it would... Yeah, not the PowerPoint, as usual. Okay. Well, now I can see the presentation. Would be helpful if the audience also can see it. Okay. Good. So that's where we are, Copenhagen. Now, on the policy context, as I said, we're not a research institution. We work in a particular policy context. And the key political agenda of the current European Commission is the European Green Deal. And there are several elements of the European Green Deal, policy elements that require climate-related risk assessments. We have a new EU adaptation strategy since last year, which mentions a EU-wide climate risk assessment. I'll come back to this in a moment. There's an EU mission adaptation to climate change, which requires harmonized climate risk assessments at the regional level, subnational regions. I will not go into this today. And that there are also requests to link so-called national risk assessment, which are going beyond climate, more closely with the climate change agenda. So there's a lot happening here. And I will first go back, but I'm actually most interested in getting feedback on the project we are starting now. So in the past, we've done reports on climate impacts in Europe, they had a indicator-based framework, about 40 indicators, and this is the table on the scenario use. So of course, I don't expect you to read it. That's not the purpose of it. But just the fact that it requires a dense 2-page table shows the heterogeneity of the underlying information base. So it's very much reflecting what Hans Otto Partner said. We used whatever was available out there in the literature, compiled it. There were also some constraints of the framework being quantitative, and so anything from SRS scenarios, RCP scenarios across the indicators, depending on the underlying information. And for some of the indicators, we could use 2 scenarios, a high and a low emission scenarios, to highlight the importance of climate mitigation. But often we actually just focused on the order of magnitude of projected changes. And also importantly, in the context of those indicators framework, the socioeconomic scenarios played hardly a role, because most of those indicators were still in the biophysical realm, where there was little sensitivity to that. Yeah, this is just one way to summarize this. Now, we also had a relatively nice map overview, and then a rather complex table overview of what we know about the changes observed and projected changes in the various indicators. And once again, it's a big 2-page table, so you just see, let's say, an excerpt of it. What is important here is to say that scenarios were not relevant for the summary table of the report. If we compiled the summary, we looked at how good is the evidence base for the direction of change across the region. Do the observations show the same as the projections? Are there large differences across regions in Europe, like for the 4 regions here? And also indicating by colors, is it mostly good or bad, beneficial or adverse for us? And the same actually held for a number of, let's say, sector-based reports, where we looked at climate impacts, adaptation needs in Europe on agriculture, on energy. The important information was usually on the direction and the order of magnitude of change, not on quantitative scenarios. There's no time to go into much detail here, just to say we also reviewed, this is like 3-4 years ago, the use of scenarios, emissions or forcing scenarios, and socioeconomic scenarios and national climate risk assessments in Europe. There's a considerable variation regarding the role of those scenarios. Some risk assessments used no scenarios at all, others had a very sophisticated approach, but most of them used like 2 or 3 of the forcings or emission scenarios. And about half of them also said they did consider socioeconomic changes. For further information, please have a look at the report. Now, more recently, we tried to get a bit up to speed with technology, with making information available in a more interactive way. So one of the projects I've been coordinating was the development of the European Climate Data Explorer, where we work closely together with the Copernicus Climate Change Service. And the pilot version that's available at the moment allows the interactive exploration of some 20 climate indices based on data that is available in the Copernicus Climate Data Store. And here, usually there are 2 or 3 emission scenarios, or technically correct forcing scenarios, that can be chosen, whereas once again, for those climate hazards, the socioeconomic scenarios are not relevant. We also developed, this is a different way to make information interactively available in Europe. First, web report, Europe's Changing Climate Hazards. Here the purpose is basically to complement the information from one source, from the Copernicus Climate Change Service, with other information sources, so that we cover all the climatic impact drivers from the recent IPCC 6th assessment report. Once again, for the interactive part, usually you can choose 2 or 3 RCPs, whereas for the summary table, the scenarios are not relevant again, because here the focus is on the direction of changes. Maybe to mention, this is something where we were only indirectly involved. The Joint Research Center of the European Commission has run a number of projects called PESETA projects on
biophysical and socioeconomic modeling of climate impacts in Europe. Here in the latest version, they looked at 3 global warming levels. In the next version, they will also look at different time horizons. Socioeconomic and demographic scenarios were actually only partly used because the overall impact estimates assume a static economy. And I'm sure they're trying to improve on that in the next version. Now, looking forward, and this is where I'm really also interested in your feedback and to learn from you. We've now been asked to conduct the first so-called European climate risk assessment, and this happens in the context, let's say, of the increasing importance of climate risks and climate adaptation in the European policy agenda. The framing is not without challenges. Let's start with the objectives. So the objective is to help identify key climate change risks and ideally also the adaptation-related policy priorities for the next European Commission. So there's considerable political buy-in. The key challenge is that it really has to be a fast-track assessment to be conducted more or less in the next 1.5 years. Here it says before summer 2024, but the technical work has to be concluded next year. And it will consist of a combination of, let's say, a review-focused report and accompanying products such as interactive data viewers. Yeah, so the short time frame mandates that it will be a review-type assessment, so we will not be able to have a consistent quantitative analysis looking at the risk factors. It will use a similar approach as IPCC, but of course then the question is what can we do on top of it? So I would say there are 2 key improvements. One is a specific link to the policy framework at the European level, and the other one a more consistent consideration of key quantitative data sources from global modeling projects as well as from European ones. So the quantitative base shall be strengthened, but based largely on information that is already out there or that is foreseen to come out. I mean, this is just a tentative list of key information sources. Some of them I've already mentioned. Of course, IPCC provides key input on the global level, also at the European level with the European chapter, but then there are also other modeling projects out there that we will review systematically. And yeah, I mentioned there will be different outputs, a cross-sectoral summary, then a sectoral report with more, well, actually it should be called systemic risk chapters because we've evolved from a more sectoral view to a systems view and interactive viewers, which have a higher spatial resolution than these report-type products. I think we've also evolved a little bit, but I still leave it as an open question here for your reflection on the possible use of scenarios in those different products. Is it RCPs and time slices, as it was in CMIP 5, where a lot of the literature is still based on SSP, RCPs and time slices, or global warming level that would somehow allow the, let's say, integration of products of results from both of those modeling phases, or even more than one option. And the key considerations from our perspective is indeed on the availability of consistent projections for emissions and socioeconomic variables. Of course, also the availability of climate impact projections based on these scenarios. Then also the question of how does it work out in visualizations. When we think of interactive products, warming levels works well for maps, but when you have time series graphs, you kind of need to have the time dimension explicit. How can this be done? And then also the scientific validity of all the visualizations. We've heard about different lines of evidence informing the latest IPCC Working Group 1 assessment of the equilibrium climate sensitivity, the so-called CMIP 6 model issue. How does this play into the selection of scenarios if we maybe have a biased model selection here? And of course, what are the stakeholder preferences? So, final slides. These are really my questions for you. One is on the integration of socioeconomic pathways for Europe. Maybe the first question is not fully correct on, yes, global SSPs have been downscaled for European countries or regions, definitely in the Impressions project, but is there any more recent work going on in this area? At what resolution would such more recent scenarios, if they're available, be available? How has the community dealt with, let's say, the increasing uncertainties at smaller scales? Because the smaller the scale, the more influence local impacts usually have. And which scenarios, which variables are actually most relevant for regional adaptation planning? Can we be quite selective, maybe with a few key variables rather than throwing on a huge framework of a scenario exercise that is actually then largely ignored? So what are the practitioner experiences here? We're now learning more and more about climate tipping points and the limitations of the more smooth scenarios when there's tipping points involved. What about the socioeconomic tipping points? Examples, pandemics, wars, how have they been considered? And what role do these climate and SSP scenarios have in different policy contexts? And here, the one that I'm particularly interested in is indeed the last one, the planning, regional climate risk assessment and management. So I'm open to questions also in the past, but I'm particularly interested in your feedback about the planned project, either here in the plenary, also afterwards. I will be around. Thank you.
Yeah, for the sake of time, maybe one very quick question, and then we will continue and maybe pick this up later after the other presentations as well.
My name is, I don't know, can you hear me? Yeah, my name is Ellen Benveniste. I'm a postdoc at Harvard. I was wondering whether you could just say very quickly if the European agency is considering migration as part of adaptation strategies, or is it just really adaptation in situ? Maybe I missed it. Thank you.
Well, we have been running some consultations with our member countries, and here we learned that, let's say, cross-border impacts are of particular interest for the countries, because most of them, or actually all of them in Europe, have now already conducted national climate vulnerability or risk assessments differently, but that the cross-border impacts and migration would be one example. Security issues, trade issues is one that was covered only by a limited number of member countries. So there's a particular interest, but so far there is at the European level not a specific strategy to deal with this, but that would be something to point out indeed.
Thanks very much. Let's continue with the second speaker on the European context. Raduska. Yeah.
This is not the first slide. Yeah. So I have 10 minutes. I'll try to speed up. Maybe we are a bit late. Okay, so I'm going to present you, this is an output from the Europe chapter, so we are again in Europe. It's the assessment of the key risks we did for the Europe chapter, but this with a view more toward adaptation. So I will start with talking about communicating risk assessment in IPCC work, presenting some examples, some deep dive, and moving beyond risk assessment. So going toward the adaptation and linking with adaptation pathways, and some idea about what's next and challenges and knowledge gap. So here, as you see in this slide, you've seen also this morning already the burning numbers. When it comes to risks and when it comes to communicating risks, the burning numbers remain quite an effective way. I can say we have used this in the last few months, also after the release of the report, broadly with different audience. And this figure, which shows the key risk for Europe as a function of warming, it was quite clear. So when it comes really to understand risks and risk accrual, the burning numbers remain very effective. Here we didn't differentiate by SSP, although we had an extensive literature also on that for Europe, but there was, what we show here is more sensitivity to socioeconomic condition, which is, let's say, low to medium adaptation. We show this here. So in the next slide, I want to show you something about more of the literature that went into this. So here is a slide showing how we link, for example, here we have the hazard here, and we show how we overlay this for different warming level with exposure. And this in the next, what we wanted to have on one side, you see the burning amber here with the present or medium adaptation condition, and we try to understand what will be the situation with high adaptation. So this is for one particular risk, which is of heat stress, and we try to do this systematically for all of them, although it was not possible always for all of them. So in the first case, again, is scenario neutral, but what we have here, we were, as I say, interested in looking how we could connect this with the situation with high adaptation. And so here we synthesize across a range of literature, a broad range of literature, but the scenario mostly going into it was mostly consistent with SSP1. And here in the next slide is an ideal study that, well, we use in our chapter. The data was kindly provided to us. It was a study from ROA where we really linked the hazard with exposure and vulnerability. So this is really showing how, for example, SSP1 condition can really alleviate future risk because of lower vulnerability. But now, finally, we were also interested in going beyond the risk assessment and so really provide a narrative which directly link risk and also adaptation with what to do about it. So we did this by using the adaptation pathways, and I'll show you what we meant here. So the adaptation pathway have been around for quite a long time, and the idea of the adaptation pathway in the specific context of this chapter was that adaptation pathway really allowed to break down adaptation into small steps and also show risk dependencies and also trade-off between options. So the idea was that scenario could really understand by using the pathway, we can really use scenario to go back and check which adaptation option are consistent with which pathway, with which scenario. And I'll try to show you this in the next couple of slides. So I take one example of one key risk that we have there and the adaptation pathway that we assess by aggregating across the literature on adaptation. So here you can see that on the left side we have, again, the burning amber for one specific risk. And then we see that in the next couple of decades, and to maintain the risk at low level as we move towards a warming world, we have a number of adaptation options that are available, mostly protective adaptation options. These options have high path dependency. For example, if you look at insurance in order to maintain its effectiveness, so to really reduce the risk, will need to be increasingly combined with, for example, with protective measure, which is also something we see in the literature, to maintain its effectiveness at higher warming. We also see lower another sort of future that starts to emerge, which is a future in which we also have relocation or retreat. This is a situation that takes a long time to become effective, and that's why we have the lead time of this measure is starting already. As we go on and as we finish this whole picture with the pathway, which are illustrative in this case, are just a way to show how measure could be combined, we see suddenly a dichotomy in the future. So we see on one side, we see a future where we have a lot of protective measure with uncertain effectiveness, which is shown here in the with the dotted line, as opposed to a future where we have a risk reduction, which is probably stronger, is to do with planned relocation and no build zone. So they are sort of two opposite or two, let's say, different pathways that emerge. So in all this, you might wonder, where is the scenario? So, and this is an afterthought, right? That came after also we developed this. This approach is scenario neutral in terms of the SSP, but scenario can be, for example, developed or thought as compatible, for example, with a narrative of continuing on a protection pathway. And the protection pathway is a pathway of high urbanization, for example, because, and this is highlighted here by the key messages 1 and 2, or as opposed, for example, to a pathway which is compatible with the location, which demands space and could be combined with lower population or lower urbanization. So finally, one last message here that we really wanted to convene is communicating risk assessment start with risk assessment, right? But it goes on to link this when it's in the context of adaptation with understanding the feasibility of adaptation, the effectiveness, so having scenario of adaptation, but at the same time understanding how we get there, so sequencing the option that lead us to that adaptation future is something that we wanted also to make sure is connected here. And that's why deriving the pathway was a way to show this illustrative future in terms of implementing adaptation. So let's say this chain here could be developed, and then scenario can be used in terms of their compatibility with a different adaptation future. Yes. So just to conclude, few things we noticed when we were doing this exercise, actually. At least for the chapter I was included and where we did the study, is that the regional assessment really helped. And also the regional SSP, but there was little consistency also even on how the delineation of the region within the literature. Also, there are very diverse risk metrics, which is great because this means there is diverse literature, but make the assessment and let's say the synthesis also more challenging. There are also very diverse assumptions and heterogeneous use of scenario in the literature. We also have for some systems very limited literature like ecosystem, but ecosystems are affected by those scenarios. And we also see that evidence is really clustered around specific warming level or also around specific timing. And vulnerability, the matrix I showed you before on the heat stress is really one of a kind of the study, at least for the chapter where we were. And well, vulnerability is still not well represented in scenarios. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Quick questions for Veruska? Chris?
Thank you. This is just a suggestion on the embers is the way the embers are portrayed, they're not scenario neutral. Because the embers going to 4 degrees, you can only do that if you're at SSP 8.5. And so it is not neutral. And that's why in the health embers in the SPM for working group 2, there's bounding of what, yeah. But that's implicit that you have to have, that there is scenarios in there because of where you bound the temperature. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much. We will continue also talking about the burning embers, I guess, with Carl's presentation.
Yeah, thank you. Acutely aware of us eating into the discussion space, so I try to be very brief. Yeah, while we are starting, the slides are being brought up, I can already start to introduce this a little bit. Those are none of mine.
Das ist alles sicher. Also
Okay.
Haben Sie sie uploaded?
Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay. Would it be okay if I just plug in my own computer?
This will not work. I'm sorry.
Okay.
My chef told me it would work. Ja, ein USB-Stick würde funktionieren.
No, I don't have it.
Then you would have to put your slides on the USB.
I would suggest we might continue with Brian, and then I'll come back.
Yeah.
Apologies, I've asked before the session if my slides are there, and I was confirmed they are, but they're not. So, okay.
Yeah, sorry about that. I expected some things that need to be figured out first because it's the first parallel session. So even at EGU last month there were some issues, and I was surprised that at EGU also it was difficult. So yeah, sorry about that. Brian is there, so let's continue with Brian's presentation, and then Carl will be the last one to present. Sorry about these issues. Brian, can you hear us?
I can. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
No. Now you can hear me, right? So yeah, it depends a bit on how the microphone is put, but we could hear you very well.
Okay.
I think they are pulling up your slides right now, and then we will let you know when you can start.
Okay, I mean, I can just share the screen.
Yeah, perfect.
Here.
Perfect. No, that's perfect.
Yeah, and I'm gonna start off without slides for a little bit. And so thanks. I'm glad I'm able to join you at least virtually today. I was hoping to be there in person, but the COVID gods had something else in mind. So I also wanted to point out, of course, like many people, this is a shorter version of a talk that they posted a longer video on the EASA Connect site. So if anything doesn't make sense or you want some more context, you can check that one out. And really the core of the message here is just making a proposal with the beginnings of an example of the kind of scenarios that I think we should be producing at the moment, both for synthesis and for communication, and that we're not doing that much of right now. And I'm calling these scenarios of outcomes. That's in the title of the talk. And what I mean by that is that to be putting together scenarios of outcomes for society and for ecosystems that include the effects of climate change impacts, of mitigation, adaptation, and importantly of non-climatic factors as well. And these outcomes include things like health of the population, what food and water security looks like, what incomes are, and what the status and trends in poverty are, how much conflict there might be, what's happening to ecosystems and biodiversity, and so on. And we can contrast these scenarios of outcomes with what we've done so far in the scenarios framework, which is to develop scenarios of inputs, we might call them, right? Because the SSPs and the RCPs are, on the one hand, socioeconomic scenarios as if climate doesn't exist, and climate futures that are divorced from socioeconomics. And of course, as we know, that was by design. They were explicitly designed that way because we put them together in lots of different studies, thousands of them by now. And so these are inputs to those studies that then look at how these society and climate trends will interact with each other. And that's great. There's been lots of work done. It's been very important. But what we don't have is scenarios that describe the results. And this is a problem, I think, because I don't believe we have a clear, cohesive sense of what the world will actually look like with climate change. When I talk to people, certainly outside the scientific community, but also within the scientific community, I am constantly surprised by how far off their impressions or understanding of the climate risks for the future are from what's in the scientific literature. And there's probably many reasons for that. I want to point to a couple that I think are relevant, well, certainly relevant to this talk. And one is that I think in our assessment process, we don't have any central means to communicate results. We have a lot of information on different climate risks, and I'll just focus on risks for now. They're presented in various ways. They use different metrics, but it's very hard to pull all of them together. And we generally, for the most part, leave that to the audience. Say, here's a whole bunch of stuff about risks. You kind of figure it out, put it together, and see what you think the world's going to look like. And I would argue that scenarios are our best and most flexible way of actually doing that. Second is that studies and assessments overwhelmingly present results on climate change impacts as the additional effects of climate change rather than absolute conditions. And I think that this leads to a distorted view of the future. And so, for example, right, as we're used to hearing and reporting ourselves results like climate change may drive tens to 100 million additional people into poverty. There may be 50 million additional people at risk of hunger due to climate change, but we don't communicate, well, how many total people will there be in hunger or in poverty in these futures with climate change? How will that compare to today? Will things be better off or worse off? And I think frequently, because impacts of climate change are generally negative, the assumption by the audience is that, well, therefore the world will be getting worse. When in many cases, not all, but in many cases, the real story is that things will generally be getting better, just not as quickly as they might have. A related factor is that when we do talk about the component of those changes due to climate change, we rarely put that in context, right, of like a historical event or trend or something that we may know about or even have lived through and experienced, so that it's hard for audiences to grasp what these sort of abstract numbers may mean and how big these things are or aren't. So the proposal is that we use scenarios of outcomes to address these problems. And you may be saying to yourself, well, yeah, right, that's what assessments are for, and that's what IPCC is for, and I believe that's true, but we're not really doing it, right? We're doing it some in working group 1, some in 3, not much in 2, and we're not using them to pull these things together in an integrated way. So let me just use the rest of my time here to give you an example, a short one for one scenario. I will share my screen here, and hopefully you will be able to see this. I will put it in presentation mode. Okay. So I will give you an example of a storyline which I have based mainly on large-scale modeling studies. So that's a caveat, though I consider that really an important backbone to scenarios, although, of course, not the final word. This is, I'm going to use the most straightforward example possible, which is an SSP2 middle-of-the-road scenario. No mitigation, just to keep things simple. Climate, so in most SSP2 impact studies, the climate change assumptions that are used have about 2 degrees of warming by the middle of the century and 3 degrees by the end, just to understand what's going on the climate side. And there's lots of caveats here, and many are probably already jumping to your mind, but I won't go into them. I do just want to point out, just for this example, I'm just going to include food security, poverty, and health as impact. And for health, I'm just looking at heat-related mortality just to get started. So I want to advance the slides. Okay, there we go. So I'm basically going to kind of describe a short piece of a storyline here and then just show an underlying quantitative outcome or two. And so overall, the kind of synthetic outcome for this storyline is that in this SSP2 unmitigated baseline, food security increases, health conditions improve, and poverty declines in all regions of the world at a pace largely consistent with historical trends. Climate change slows down these improvements more substantially for some outcomes and in some regions. And so, for example, in the global population at risk of hunger continues its historical decline, falling from about 700 million today to about 250 million by 2050, driven by increased incomes, increased yields, and a somewhat more equitable distribution of food within countries. Climate impacts slow down that progress, preventing the number that are in hunger from falling even further to 225 rather than 250 million. In the two least food secure regions, the population at risk declines by nearly half in sub-Saharan Africa and by 2/3 in India. Health conditions improve at a modest pace in all regions of the world. The net effect of climate change on premature deaths from either cold or heat, averaged globally, is modest. In the more exposed and vulnerable low-income countries, heat mortality rates approximately double on average from their current levels by the end of the century. And this increase in mortality is on par with current mortality rates for diseases like liver cancer or HIV. In terms of poverty rates continue their historical decline from nearly 2 billion in 1990 to about 600 million today, and fall further to about 100 million by 2050. And much of this decline occurs in sub-Saharan Africa, driven by rising incomes and some changes in inequality. Climate change again slows progress, adds about 40 to 100 million to global poverty in 2030, mainly through impacts on health, food prices, and disasters. And this is an impact on poverty about the same as COVID is estimated to be having today. In 2050, impacts add fewer people to poverty, around 10 million, as income growth is outpacing climate effects. Okay, so this narrative may or may not be what you'd expect with an unmitigated SF22 future, but there it is, and this is based on the same studies that we're using in AR6, in the Working Group 2 report, and the special reports before that. To give you just a brief look at those, I'll show a couple results. One caveat for the results in the storyline, I did have to do a little triangulation to get results for these scenarios and time periods and so on. So while they may not be exact, they are, I'm sure, in the right ballpark. So just as an example, and I won't show all of these for the sake of time, but to just give you an idea of what's underlying this. For food security, I'm relying on a large model comparison exercise, the kind of study that I think we need many more of for many different impacts. The dark line here on the right shows the mean outcome for the numbers of people at risk for hunger with climate impacts globally. The light shaded area is the range across models, and these are global results, but as mentioned in the storyline, this decline occurs in all regions of the world. Without climate change, this line would have declined marginally more, down to 225 by the middle of the century rather than 250. For health, and I'll just go to figure here, and we'll just look on at that. I'm relying on an example in the literature we have of a global study of heat mortality that includes societal change and some adaptation. And on the right, you see that red bar is the anticipated mortality of about 10 deaths per 100,000 people per year, projected by the end of the century in low-income countries from heat. And we can compare that to current levels of mortality. Those are in the blue bars. And you see it doesn't really stack up to whole categories of mortality like cancer or cardiovascular disease, but it does for individual causes of death like HIV or liver cancer or breast cancer, so on. So I'll skip the quantitative basis for poverty, but that's drawn from the literature as well. And finally, I just want to say, I hope this gives you a sense of what you of the kind of scenarios we could pull together. Hopefully you can imagine having several of these, quantitative and qualitative, for different development pathways, levels of climate change, including mitigation, looking at different regions and so on. I'm summarizing here the features I think that these scenarios should have, which we've talked about already. And I also think that we should actually, we can do these now with the literature we have, but I think we should also be orienting the scenarios framework toward the goal of producing such scenarios of outcomes. And this would have several implications, I think, for how we go about producing such scenarios and for how we do scientific assessment. But I will leave that to further discussion. Thanks.
I hope you can hear me. Questions for Brian? Hans Martin. I think there's a microphone just coming up.
Hi, Brian. Hans Martin Frizzle here. Sorry you can't make it in person, but glad to see you're fit enough to present here. Let me ask a provocative question. I mean, in terms of climate, we say that the last, 10,000 years have been an unusually stable period in which the human civilization developed, and that's why we are so concerned about small changes to it. Now, if we look at the last 50, 60 years that YASA existed, that we developed scenarios, that has also been, at least for people in Europe and North America, an unusually stable period where a lot of those scenario predictions came true. Now, how confident are you looking forward that we don't have major, let's say, discontinuity in the political system, the social system, that would make those beneficial projections seem unrealistically optimistic? And would you change the approach looking at those, let's say, socioeconomic, sociopolitical uncertainties? Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think that the usefulness of presenting and synthesizing results in this way is that I think it can direct more clearly our questions like that toward their real source, right? So that now we're now talking about, you're asking about the baseline scenarios, right? And that's a legitimate question. Are our baseline scenarios overly optimistic? Well, we should check into that, because we're trying to describe these how the world may turn out, and maybe our whole outlook is shifted more to the optimistic side. But then that's different, right, from saying the climate change science is an issue, right? So if things could turn out worse, then we want to identify, well, why is that? We want to clearly communicate to people in the audience to say, well, based on the climate studies and our scenarios, here's what the world looks like. Now, if that doesn't sound right to you, let's figure out why not. Is it that you have a problem with the research on the climate impacts? Are we leaving something out of that? Is it a problem with the global studies? Or is it a problem with the baseline scenarios? And it may be, but I think this can help us focus on number one, what's in the literature, and number two, if we feel something's wrong with the answer, to focus in on what may be the underlying source of that unease.
Thanks very much. We are running very late on time, so I think we should continue with Carl's presentation, and then maybe stick around for a couple of minutes longer into the coffee break. Let's continue with Carl's presentation first. Thank you, Brian.
Okay, so second try. Apologies for the technical glitch. I hope you can see my slides now. Excellent. I can see why Brian's presentation would be a great way to start our discussion. So apologies for now coming after him, but taking us a little bit back to the RFC. So I try to be brief in order for us to have a little bit of a discussion still. I'm largely presenting a study that was led by Luke Harrington, and it's already out there and published. So if you probably some of the methodological details I'll skip, and you can read them up there. I'm dealing with a concept around, or like looking into RFCs and how to quantify uncertainties in them. It's basically it's an IPCC classic in terms of our communication products, and it features very heavily also in the AS6. So we've seen this in the presentation of Veruska and different variants. These are the global ones, highlighting 3 different risk levels from moderate to high to very high risks with basically different descriptions. And they are very prominent in the AS6. So we are now just not only having global ones, we do have regional ones, we do have some for ecosystems, different subsystems, we do have integrated into the framework some assumptions around adaptation and how those would pan out, as we've seen before. So there's a lot in there, and the concept is definitely one of the most common or popular ones in terms of communicating climate risks out there. So there are some good questions to ask around it, and I'm sure you're also all very aware, and some people who have been very deeply involved in producing these figures are here with us in the room, and there's also, with every product or every kind of high-level aggregation, there's some questions and some also critique of those concepts that is worth reflecting on. So I just want to summarize a few points and then try to show how we unpack them in our study a little bit, and then this is also where the scenarios are coming in. So if you are concerned now that this does look rather static and not very scenario driven, we will try to bring them into the equation somehow. So the big first question is, okay, these are expert assessments. This is basically what the IPCC is mandated to do, but what is the level of expert assessment that actually informs those figures, and how does it come in? How can I basically understand what of this is data-driven, what is expert-driven? How do I map a range of very different indicators in different studies against global mean temperature increase? And also probably very prominent in particular for the global ones, how do I actually aggregate to a global risk? So, how many millions of square kilometers need to be affected? How many million people or billion people need to be affected by something before I say, okay, this is now a global risk? And of course, normally, basically what we have in terms of global mean temperature, it's an indicator, or it's a decent indicator for many climate hazards, not all. But what about vulnerability and exposure, and how to bring them in, and how do we bring them into such a rather static framework? So what we've done is not what the AS6 approach is, and I'm sure AS6 authors are very much invited to also provide their perspectives on those questions, of course. But I'll present what we've done in this study that was published in November last year. And basically what we do is we take one single heat indicator, just as an illustration. So we take the hottest day in the year, and then we do this as basically a signal-to-noise ratio. So we're not just taking the change in temperature, but we are taking the change in the hottest day of the year relative to the natural variability. So it's a signal-to-noise measurement. What this means is we're not highlighting necessarily the regions with the highest absolute temperature increase, but the regions with the highest temperature increase relative to natural variability or the stable climate. This has direct implications that we're going to see in the results. We can debate which indicator to choose, but the results are going to be reasonably similar, and we did some sensitivity tests around that as well. Then we have exposure, so we have SSP-driven changes in population that are exposed, and we have also tried to approximate vulnerability. This is a very contested and multidimensional question on how do we measure vulnerability, but we just kind of now choose one proxy, which is a governance indicator that can also be related to the SSPs. So doing all of this, we now have all these dimensions together, and we try to throw them into the mix, and what comes out is something like this figure, which is not very intuitive to understand. But bear with me, I'll try to talk you through it quickly. So what you see on the x-axis is the governance index, where we assume 0 is very bad, 1 is perfect, and we map the world population against it. The signal-to-noise ratio, that says basically the emerging climate signal, and this is for 2050 on an SSP2 scenario for 2 degrees of warming. And the blue areas that you see there is basically population density map in terms of the exposed population and where they would sit in this vulnerability versus climate signal landscape. And that's not all of it yet, because now we need to bring in the dimension of vulnerability in that context. And how we did this is that we said, well, okay, we are now just assuming different risk levels. So we say moderate is when we can detect it, so when our signal is outside by signal to noise is bigger than 1. Then we say for the high risk and very high risk emergence, we assume some kind of dependency on the vulnerability. So countries with a low vulnerability, so closer to 1, can deal with stronger emergence of climate hazards than countries that are closer to or that are very poor governance or very high vulnerability, as we approximate by this. So that basically you see these lines going up. So for very high risk, they would emerge for a country with very poor governance at the 3 sigma event, which is around one in a couple of 100 years event, would be the new normal climate. And then for countries where we are in with basically minimum level of vulnerability, this would be a 5 sigma event. So this would really be unprecedented climate being the new norm, which would also by in itself probably fulfill a criterion for a very high risk. So with this mapping, this is a lot of expert judgment on our side. And what we did now is kind of vary these assumptions. So now we have a lot more of those. And don't worry, I'm not going to explain them in detail. But what we did is we mapped now climate uncertainty. So what if we take the CMU5 ensemble? How would the results look like if we take the 10th percentile or the 19th percentile? That's the upper one. What would it look like if we take different SSP scenarios? That's the middle layer. And what would it look like if we take different assumptions on basically how our vulnerability indicator actually maps on the risk that we're interested in? So we are having basically a stronger gradient with positive governance, so we basically have much lower impacts because adaptation is better, or we have no adaptation at all because it might not be possible. So we do this in a systematic fashion, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the implications of those in a second, but that's not all we have to do, because now we have mapped the global population against those indicators, but we still don't actually know how we now bring this together into one global bar that we are interested in. So now we need to make another decision, which in this case is how many billion people do we think need to be affected or need to be in one of those categories before we can say, oh, the global risk is now high or very high. So to do this, we are now also setting 3 arbitrary thresholds. So we say it either needs to be at least 750 million in a risk-averse approach, it needs to be 1.5 billion in a medium, or it needs to be 3 billion if we are saying risk tolerance. So 3 billion people in a certain category, and then we kind of decide the global bar with switch color. And this is, you already see now them, so we are kind of able to map them, also able to map them against different SSPs as one source of uncertainty are being shown here together. And you do see they all depend to some extent on SSPs, but they also very strongly depend on where we would set a global threshold, which wouldn't surprise us necessarily, but it implies quite a strong implication in terms of what the levers are that bring you, some of these communication products. And to keep us short and kind of directly cut to the results, because it is a bit of a technical explanation, but in the paper we can unpack this a little bit more. By doing this mapping and asking ourselves what are all the decisions that we need to take to kind of produce something that looks like a burning ember, what are the key sources of uncertainty if we map them systematically? And what turns out, at least in our particular analysis, and it might be very different for others, is that the 2 most impactful ones are actually expert judgments. Even though we consider full climate uncertainty, even though we would consider a range of different SSP assumptions, what matters in the end still is a level of how do we basically aggregate a global risk? What does it mean? How do we do this? What are the criteria? Well, also in our case, the dependency on the vulnerability mapping. So basically, how much do we assume adaptation would play into such a risk assessment for a different global warming level? Then we can map them. We've mapped also kind of the range in terms of hundreds of million or billion of people that are affected, and there might be a few takeaway sessions, few takeaway conclusions for us to explore a little bit more if we've still time, which are more around what we've learned, also in terms of scenario science and what it requires in terms of scenario communication. So we have probably attempted to do a full exploration of the space with one variable and with all the caveats that come with this, because this is not comprehensive in terms of all the climate risks that we would ever want to look at. But we still found that even if we do this, there's a high level of expert judgment that kind of brings along then such iconic products that the one that we've seen from the IPCC. And then the question is, how can we increase transparency on such a regard? How can we help to make them more accessible, but also, for example, decide or have end-user-based approaches towards making some of those choices to illustrate what different choices would mean in terms of risk levels and basically communication of client products. With that, I thank you for your attention. Apologies for technical glitches again, and I have one message to communicate from Jan Minks, who has been presenting earlier. So if there are any, because he can't be with us here today, and we did the study together, so if there are any questions or follow-ups that you would have more like kind of as a coffee chat on this AI approach and the impacts that Jan has been presenting, please also feel free to approach me, and then I'll make sure this is passed on to Jan. Thank you very much.
Please, your question to Carl. And I think, by the way, Carl, that this is as well as a presentation for starting the discussion as the one that Brian had.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Carl. Very nice presentation. Yeah, Volker Krei from YASA. So what's the takeaway? I mean, I think this is a really nice contribution. I think one can, I mean, the fact that there are lots of assumptions going into studies, and this, I think this doesn't only hold for the burning embers, but probably also for other types of judgments that go into assessment. So what's the takeaway in terms of improving assessments to do this? I mean, do we need basically virtual products on top of IPCC products that allow you to basically explore these assumptions? I mean, I'm sure you've been putting some thoughts into how this can be addressed.
Do you want me to come in? Yeah. No, thanks. Very, very good question. I think kind of like a little bit, the easy way out that we advocate for is increased transparency, which is always nice to say and very difficult to implement. I think in some ways what we try to do is we try to use those ranges, basically transition ranges, as a tool to be informed by basically the range of uncertainty that we assess. So we say, okay, basically given on the different SSPs and some levels of our different judgment, we find risk transitions between 1.5 and 2.5 degrees, for example. Because, and I think that's one way, and at least for this particular visual, to try to bring in this question, and at least has some kind of systematic reflection in the outcome of the sensitivity test that you've done. And I think that's probably a little bit the question there in terms of if we continue along those lines. I think, yeah, virtual products are definitely something that the IPCC could explore, and it would help people to get more accustomed to such questions. But I think it is also indeed trying to find ways of basically making these decision points more explicit and illustrating the implications of decision points that are being made in terms of the outcome, and ideally trying to find neat ways to include them in the visual representation or any other aggregation. I mean, that's also, again, easier said than done. I mean, what we did is saying, okay, there are these risk transition levels, so maybe that's a way to reflect it. But I think that's really more also an open discussion. I think for us, we didn't actually, for us it was more a surprise to see how dominant basically these choices really affect our results, even if we account for everything else.
Hello. Yeah, Ed Byers from YASA. Thanks, Carl. Really interesting. I thought a lot about on this particular topic also, and say politely, not surprised by your findings. But very interesting. And the question's also a bit also to Hans Martin, which I wanted to ask before, is perhaps for both of you, but what's the philosophy in communication to the public, perhaps from both of the different organizations that you work with in finding the right balance? And I think on your internet online data visualization, you could choose something like heat wave days per year, and most of the public can understand what this means. But there are other climate indicators that are more technical and complex that is only understood by a small number of experts, or we can go to very kind of more abstract indices. And what do you think is better, or how to strike the balance from different types of stakeholder groups in making you make a decision on what's a risk threshold, but then you perhaps abstract what the actual indicator is behind it.
I can make a start, and maybe Hans Martin can add, and maybe also others. Chris, Lena, please, Brian, please come in on that question. My personal take would be less is more. I think that's also why we engage with this. So it's not meant to, I think it's not a concept we should abandon. Quite to the contrary, I think it's one of the most successful communication products that we have developed in terms of how climate risks evolve. So I think we should very strongly, or that's my personal view, is like we should work towards further substantiating it on the one hand to kind of allow people to engage with it more, but on the other hand maybe use it also in more flexible communication purposes. So, and I think that's what the working group 2 tried. So by bringing, basically more burning embers out there and trying to bring more dimensions in, you try to make it, to build on a concept that people are used to engage with, and try to further basically provide information in the same framing. I think if you speak end users, and this includes also many policy decision makers and so on, I mean, scenario presentations might not always be as easy to understand as a color scheme. So I think it is something to be very mindful of, and then maybe something that one can rather build and improve on, given where we are, and also in terms of science communication, where we know people are accustomed to certain outcomes. But I can't speak for the RPC motivation, of course, so I would very much hope for others to provide their perspective on it, but that's my personal take.
I can complement briefly. I mean, what I have seen in the 12 years that I've been working at the European Environment Agency after an academic career is that our stakeholder basis at the European Environment Agency is broadening in a number of ways. I mean, at the beginning we were still a bit more in raising awareness of climate impacts, climate risks, raising awareness of the need for adaptation policy. Here it was enough to have more like static messages, report type, to basically say here that there's a problem that you have to deal with. Now this is no longer the case, at least in Europe. I mean, we're aware of that there are risks, and we need to inform a much broader area, both sectorally as well as in terms of the geographical resolution. We're no longer only addressing European policymakers, we're addressing increasingly national and subnational decision makers who are asking what is the problem for us, how reliable is the information at the subnational level, what can we do? So that's why we need to broaden our base, and here we have to rely increasingly on interactive products. Now that's again a learning project, because for the let's say for traditional reports, we are very much in control how we present things, which variables, which information, and so on. If we develop interactive products, we are more relying on information that is out there, being it Copernicus Climate Change Service or Eurocordex or what have you on the climate hazard side, being it modeling projects, PESETA, ECMIP, Coach on the climate impact, climate risk side. So here the focus is on having a dialogue between science and policy, how understandable, how reliable, how robust certain information is, because something that's just something being scientifically state of the art doesn't mean it should be used without any, let's say, a warning label in the decision making context. So we're making the progress here as I speak.
Thanks, Ed. It's a really good question. And as Hans Martin said, it really depends on who is posing a question and what is it that they want to know, right? So it's a Bayesian question. And it does depend on the decision maker and the time frame and the region and on and on. And I would actually go in a different direction, in that I really like this paper, I really like what they did, but the decision makers with whom I work want this information unpacked. So there is a transition in risk, and that's the real question for the burning embers, is where is that risk transition? And then the question is, why is there a risk transition? And how much is climate change? How much is improving our governance? How much is, in the U.S. not re-electing certain past presidents? I mean, there's all kinds of questions in there, and where, given their budget and given their energy and enthusiasm, do they need to focus? What's urgent and immediate? And to think about where the community that produces the information of how risks change over time. And so if you don't invest in mitigation today, what does that mean for your risk in 2070? And what is that going to look like compared with the other kinds of factors that were looked at? So I think this is a really important step forward. I think there's lots of possibilities to use this to start within the Burning Embers framework, provide much more policy relevant information. And the second place I would go is, I'll just use the state I live in as an example. My governor needs to deal with heat stress, with wildfires, with sea level rise, with flooding, and with drought. And we've got to start thinking about how do we bring these embers together in ways regionally that can give them a much better sense of, if you don't mitigate, you don't adapt, you don't pay attention to your governance, you don't pay attention to some key socioeconomic variables. These are the kinds of risks that you could face, because they're going to have to answer the policy information altogether in designing new approaches. If that kind of made sense. I think I was wandering off in some other direction there at the end. I think other people had questions.
Yeah, let's do these two more, and then we can continue this discussion in the coffee session, I guess. Coffee break.
Season Columbia Climate School. I guess I have a couple just general reactions. At the last Scenarios Forum I didn't organize, but I presented some work that engaged cognitive scientists in development of diagrams and maybe also involving designers and others, because I feel like a lot of this is driven by our climate science and our scientific worldviews and perceptions of what's comprehensible, and I think we often miss the mark substantially when it comes to communicating with policy audiences. I also think that maybe more than one of us in this audience have been confronted by a policymaker saying, just tell me what the most likely scenario is, and just, let's get to the punch here so that I can make my decision, or, we can develop our policy narrative and our discussion of what our options are and things like that. And so I think those are things that I feel like, this was a great session, by the way. I'm not trying to knock anyone's presentations, but I think this is where we kind of miss the mark sometimes as scientists in not understanding that, a lot of these discussions are just, and presentations of information are going to be well beyond the reach of a lot of the people that we're actually trying to reach to influence decisions. So I'll just leave it there. It's a comment not meant for any kind of general response necessarily. Someone else had a...
Thank you. Brian, are you still there? Because my question was going to be for you. And if you're not, we can go to coffee instead. Brian, yeah. Okay, Brian, I'm going to assume you can hear me. If not... Okay, Brian, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so Zebedee Nichols from IASA. The outcomes you presented on the continued reductions in poverty and improvements in health, and description of them as moderate reduction in speed due to climate change, make it look, it's actually not so bad almost. If you took a different metric, for example, the number of people who were being displaced from small island states, you might get a very different story. My question is, if you're going to talk about scenarios for outputs, how do you choose which outputs to focus on?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I would say even within a given output, right, you're going to have a range of outcomes across studies, and that's going to be a choice as well. And so, right, I think like Chris said, it depends on the audience. So if you want to tell the complete story, you want everything in there, right? Everything that the audience thinks, or that would be relevant to the audience, and then you might package these in different ways for different audiences. You may, right? We looked at global numbers, and I referred to some regional numbers, which are kind of large global regions. But if you wanted to point out, for example, migration and displacement in general globally may look pretty small. But you then, as part of your storyline and your quantification, would want to point out that, okay, but in certain regions, and for example, the best example is small island states, this is actually a big issue, right? So I think it gives you the flexibility to include what you need to include for a particular audience. When I first started thinking along these lines like a while ago, I mean, we talked about something like this in the first scenarios forum, and one of the issues that we talked about is that it's such a fraught choice of what you put in a scenario and which ones you choose to put in something like the IPCC assessment. And at the moment, I've evolved toward, yes, that's true, but I still think it's our best option. I like things like the Bernie numbers as well. I've worked on those in the past. I still have the feeling, though, for those that we have not cracked the problem of that it is a climate first presentation of risk. And what we know is in most cases, the risk does not depend on climate first. It depends on the socioeconomic development pathway first. So an approach that's climate first, just by its nature, is going to work against that kind of fundamental fact that we have already determined in the last several rounds of IPCC assessment. So right now, I think of this as, the scenario approach is more likely to do that better justice that way.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone, first of all, for your patience and for sticking around, although it's already been 15 minutes into the coffee break. Please discuss these things further in the next couple of days, and feel free to approach people and also to approach us, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to have a workshop. So it's a Chatham House workshop. So yes, I have a whole bunch of people online.
I mean, also presenters online? Or presenters?
I've got a mix of everything. So how does this show? When you showed up here, what was?
Hi, it's me. Hi.
Oh, okay.
I have all the sheets. I have the sheets. When it's time for rows, I have the sheets like the presentations. Do you speak German?
No.
All right.
Not beyond ordering myself a beer.
All right. All right. Give me a second. Es tut mir leid wegen den technischen Problemen. Es war, ich hätte gar nichts zu sagen.
Kein Problem.
Und ich weiß nicht wie, aber ich habe es irgendwie hinbekommen. Es tut mir wahnsinnig leid. Es waren noch 2, 3 Dinge, wo einfach nicht gemacht worden sind. Es tut mir leid.
Kein Problem.
Und es ist mein erster Tag.
Kein Problem. Also kein Stress, wirklich nicht. It was just about the technical problems.
No, that's it.
About the Zoom meetings, are they like one another, or are the first people here? Or
yes, tomorrow. Actually, in a different room. I was just trying to get a little bit of a head start.
So it should be all taken care of, the technical. Sorry.
Right. But I think we're going to want to do the kind of thing we were doing at the end, which is having people that are virtual make comments into a room for a conversation.
This is no problem. Tomorrow it will be no problem.
So I was thinking if I learned how to sort of toggle back and forth between virtual and the room,
Where
that
are
would
you
be really.
the next 15 minutes? Because I can probably.
Yeah, you can work on this. I was just checking in with someone who had just had that problem, and I'll let you get set up for the next session.
Yeah, I need that.
No worries.
I wish I could help you more, but I can't answer your questions.
Not a problem.
I think I should.
Sind Sie auch da für die nächsten 4 Präsentationen oder anderer Raum? Okay.
Ich glaube nicht. Ich bin mir gerade unsicher, aber ich glaube nicht.
Okay. Ich habe jetzt die 4 Präsentationen hinausgeladen.
Also für mich jetzt auch selbst persönlich die Frage, ist das okay mit den PDFs jetzt?
Nein,
oder?
Nicht. Also es war eine absolute Katastrophe, weil wir machen alles über die PowerPoints. Und sie werden ja auch im PowerPoint wahrscheinlich erstellt.
Ja, ich habe nämlich ich habe morgen und übermorgen selbst eine Präsentation, deshalb frage ich jetzt. Und die sind beide in PDFs, deshalb.
Haben Sie alles mit PDF erstellt oder mit PowerPoint?
Nee, ich habe das mit PowerPoint erstellt, aber wenn ich ehrlich bin, warum ich die PowerPoint nicht hochladen wollte, war. Warum ich die nicht hochladen wollte, war, weil es halt noch Arbeiten sind, die noch gar nicht veröffentlicht sind und dann kann halt jeder sich diese PowerPoint runterladen und machen damit, was er möchte. Deshalb, das war der Grund, warum ich das nicht, das in PDF gemacht habe.
Verständlich.
Ja.
Einfach hier die Sheets auswählen, die Sie präsentieren möchten und dann sind die restlichen nicht da. Also die einfach Copy-Paste machen, beziehungsweise ein neues System erstellen und dann eine neue PDF daraus. Weil es sind hier links die Sheets, wie viele es sind.
Ja.
Und das ist jetzt, keine Ahnung, 10 sind und davon 4 nur es möchten. Dann einfach nehmen und...
Aber dann soll ich die nicht bei IASA Connect hochladen, sondern dann morgen mitbringen zur Session.
Am besten per USB-Stick und neu hochladen.
Ja,
das
okay.
wäre super.
Also da ist dann PDF.
You have your folder here. I think it's the second session. Commentation is right. Communication. Yeah. So and here you have the presentations.
That's this one.
If you were given.
So this is probably give me a second. This is the wrong one. Ja, ich weiß, aber die wurden nicht abgefüllt. No problem. I did it. So this, therefore, who's Rose?
We're looking for him.
All right, because it's a PDF and it's a problem. Does he have the PowerPoint presentation? It would be really, really helpful.
Okay.
Because we have the split screen and I need...
This guy that's just walking in. Steve.
Do you have your presentation? Do you have the PowerPoint? Do you have the PowerPoint?
We need the PowerPoint.
Yeah. Perfect. That would be amazing. Really amazing.
Surviving. That was awful.
It was my first day. I shouldn't be sitting there. My job would be like sitting around and looking at this, and now I'm working, and I'm like, fuck. But I did it. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
I appreciated your kind of pain. I felt very sorry.
So you just write it out here, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, Jim.
So, there it is. So it's the presentation because of the link. Thank you very much. And I need this one.
I'll get the.
I need the PowerPoint here.
You said I should, or talk about me doing closing remarks.
Yes.
If you see some good points,
maybe.
then
Oh no. Oh, okay.
sorry, I have to.
I'm not sure when this. Just wait. They're going to come after the. Hello, everyone. Should we each change?
It's always in here, but I can come here.
Okay.
No problem.
I can try it. Change. Hello, everyone. Welcome. So we're going to start the session just a couple of minutes late, but that's fine. So this session is really a nice follow-on from today's plenary, where we talked a lot about the IPCC assessments. So we're going to talk about the use of scenarios in the IPCC and lessons learned from this cycle, looking out to the AR7. So the goal of the session is to discuss how the IPCC can further the use of scenarios, specifically for policy-relevant assessment reports. So here we're really going to focus on the discussion as relevant for the audience of the expectations of the IPCC assessments. So many of you, I'm just looking at the room, there are quite a few IPCC-type people. Some of you I don't know, so it's a mixed room. Many of you have heard in the approval sessions or the past few weeks in Bonn some of the questions, concerns and expectations of government representatives and observer organizations. So some of these were mentioned this morning, like transparency when using illustrative something or other, CDR, timing of net zero, regional development pathways, and so on. So please remember that we're talking in that context here in this session. And also the fact that the session is in the context of a few activities that are coming up. We'll be holding a webinar, an Iconics webinar on communications of scenario-based information and how this is picked up by a broader audience. What are the misconceptions? What are the challenges of communicating about scenarios in the media, in the arts, how to reach a broader public. And also, we're going to be doing some of the groundwork for the IPCC workshop on scenarios that Jim mentioned this morning. So we're going to think about its future assessment activities, the interactions between the working groups, links to the relevant scientific communities and organizations. So recalling the IPCC sixth assessment that's completed its cycle almost, a very rich assessment, 3 special reports and 3 working group reports. A characteristic, as you've heard enough of perhaps this morning, is that the AR6 has really been featured by enhanced coordination and integration across the working groups, in particular in the use of scenarios, and that has been from the beginning with a special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees. So depending on how the discussion goes, we may talk about the mode of working within the IPCC, or we may talk about how the assessments need to be changing or responding to the audience needs. Just in terms of mode of working, Jan and I coordinated a cross-working group team on scenarios throughout the production of the working group reports that was really trying to coordinate, share information across the working groups, discuss topics such as the use and selection of core scenarios, labeling of scenarios. And then finally, just to highlight that the synthesis is work in progress. So we still have that to look forward to, and then we'll be preparing for the AR7. So not going into this in great detail, you know that scenarios are a common dimension of integration amongst 3. Valerie presented these this morning with global warming levels and also cumulative CO2 emissions. And they allow us to synthesize and relate information that is split out between different chapters, different working group reports. So for example, thinking about possible climate futures, assessment of future risks, classification and mitigation pathways, remaining carbon budgets, and so on. And then another slide that you've already seen this morning, the magical swirl of scenario generation, and how this, on the bottom, you see how it relates to the work that goes on in the community which I think Tim said takes 10 years or so, and how it relates to the cycles of the working groups, the interlinkages, going round in one loop, but also retroactions. So it relates to the sequencing of the working group reports, the interconnections. It brings up issues of timing, sequences, as I said, mode of working, and the implications and the links to the underlying community. So we'll talk about perhaps some structural characteristics of the IPCC and how this matches with the very broad scenario community that we see here and the holistic approaches that are being sought for in scenarios. So that's it from my slides. This is a workshop, so we have 3 talks, panelists which cut across the 3 working groups. We'll have some concluding provocative remarks that will initiate a discussion, so hopefully we'll have at least 20 to 30 minutes discussion. We'll keep the questions until after the panelists have spoken. And as Jan mentioned, obviously, this is quite, building on from the plenary this morning. So if you had questions there, you're welcome to bring them up again. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our first speaker, who's Junyi Lee, from Chapter 4 of Working Group 1. She'll be followed by Steve Rose from Working Group 2, and then Keiwan Riahi, Ed Byers, and Roberto Scheifer have a presentation from Working Group 3. Thanks, Junyi.
Thank you. Sorry.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Junyi Lee, a coordinating lead author of AR6 Working Group 1, Chapter 4. The chapter is for the assessing the future global climate change. And first of all, I'd like to thank organizers for giving me this opportunity to participate. Very nice forum and also deliver this talk. And this presentation has been developed with Yuhun Marchuk, who is also a coordinating lead author of Working Group 1, Chapter 4. Scenarios are the key element in the climate change projections in the Working Group 1 report, of course. And this is the important dimension of integration across chapters, along with cumulative carbon emissions and global warming levels, as Anna mentioned earlier. And the core set of 5 shared socio-economic pathways was assessed in ARC Working Group 1. And as you can see from the figure here, they span a broader range of greenhouse gas and air pollutant futures than assessed in earlier Working Group 1 reports. The scenarios account for solar activity variability and background volcanic activity, but don't include the unpredictable but likely occurrence of a major volcanic eruption. As many of you know, the CME6 models tend to project larger warming in global surface temperature than in CME5. About half of the increase in simulated warming has occurred because higher climate sensitivity is more prevalent in the CME6 than CME5. And the other half arises from the higher effective radiative forcing in the nominally comparable scenarios. For example, the SSP5 8.5 in CME6 has higher effective radiative forcing than RCP 8.5 in CME5. Considering those aspects, for the first time in an IPCC report, we provide comprehensive assessment of future change in global surface temperature based on multiple lines of evidence. The assessment constantly combines scenario-based projections with observational constraints based on 3 different approaches, as well as the emulated change based on the updated assessment of equilibrium climate sensitivity and transient climate response. Because we don't have robust scientific evidence to constrain other climate variables, except for global surface temperature, ocean warming, and sea level, which I will show you later on, the uncertainty quantification of the other climate variables changes is mainly based on CME6 projections. Thus, we need better scientific advances to constrain those climate variables. Nonetheless, the global warming level approach provides a good opportunity to fill the gap for many climate variables such as regional temperature, precipitation, and soil moistures. However, this approach also has a limitation for the path-dependent variables or variable with slow response or variable with nonlinear fault response. The comprehensive assessment of future global surface temperature change enables a new estimate of when 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming is reached or closed. The threshold crossing time is defined as the midpoint of the first 20-year period during which the average global surface temperature exceeds the threshold. In all scenarios considered, our assessment shows that averaged over 2021 to 2040, the global surface temperature will reach 1.5 degrees Celsius increase relative to 1850 to 1900. In all scenarios considered, except SSP5 and 8.5, the central estimate of crossing the 1.5 degree global warming level lies in the early 2030s. For the first time in an IPCC report, the assessed future change of global mean sea level rise constantly combines climate, ice sheet, and glacier simulation with the updated assessment of climate sensitivity. Sea level respond to more slowly than global surface temperature, leading to a weaker scenario dependence in the near term and over the 21st century. This slow response also lead to the long-term committed sea level rise associated with ongoing ocean heat uptake and the associated slow adjustment of ice sheet instability, which will continue to contribute over the centuries or millennia following the cessation of the emissions. One of the important advances in the AI6 Working Group 1 is the improvement made in the near-term information. We now better understand the major sources of uncertainties in the near-term projection, including internal variability, model uncertainty, and uncertainties in forcings from natural and anthropogenic erosions, while the contribution from scenario uncertainty is relatively small, as you can see from the figure in your right. Single model, initial condition large ensembles, and storyline approach provides a more comprehensive spectrum of possible changes associated with the internal variability. The trajectory of anthropogenic erosion also play an important role, particularly in the near term. In all scenarios considered, simultaneous changes in methane, aerosol, and ozone precursor, which also contribute to air pollution, they lead to a net surface warming, particularly in the near term. In the long term, those net warming effect is lower under the scenario, which assuming air pollution control combined with the strong and sustained methane emissions reduction. Assessment of low likelihood, high impact outcomes is much more prominent in the AI6. Our assessment shows that low likelihood outcomes, such as ice sheet collapse, ever ocean circulation, some compound extreme event, and warming substantially larger than the assessed very likely range of future warming, cannot be ruled out and are part of a risk assessment. The figure shown here is the example of low likelihood, high warming outcomes. If global warming exceeds the assessed very likely range for a given emissions scenario, global and regional changes of many aspects of climate system, which include regional temperature, as you can see from the here, also precipitation and many other climatic impact drivers, will exceed their assessed very likely range. Those outcomes will be associated with very large impact and high risks for human and natural systems. From now on, I'd like to highlight some gaps and issues in the AI6 Working Group 1, also related to the other working groups. Even though there has been very strong collaboration and interaction across working groups, there still remain challenges in integrating scenarios across working groups for synthesis report, where also I am participating. to different approaches toward looking at the future, including the core set of SSP, RCPs, global warming level, temperature categories, then also we have the illustrative mitigation pathways. In particular, choice of scenarios in working group 1, and I think that is true for working group 2, are constrained by literature, especially for regional climate changes, where most of the study use the very high emissions scenario of SSP5 8.5 or ICP 8.5. However, there has been a growing discussion on the feasibility of those high-end emission scenario in working group 3, and also that is true for the lower end of scenario of SSP1 1.9. But no likelihood is attached to the scenarios assessed in working group 1 and also I think working group 2 as well. Thus, it is not possible to combine responses of individual forcing into the overall probabilistic statement for the expected outcome of climate change in the working group 1. But during the process, actually working group 1 reflected some of feasibility assessment in working group 3 by shifting the focus of a high emission scenario from SSP5 to SSP5 8.5 to SSP3 7.0 when we show the maps or time series. So you can see that in the many chapters we rather show SSP3 7.0 rather than SSP5 8.5. And the other issue is on the different treatment of overshoot across working groups. So the overshoot is also a very important issue for synthesis report, but we found it very difficult. One of the reasons is that working group 1 has very limited treatment of overshoot, and in our SPM, we just have one mention regarding overshoot for SSP1 1.9, mentioning with a temporary overshoot of no more than 0.1 degrees Celsius over 1.5 degree global warming. And in the chapters, such as chapter 4 and chapter 5, we actually assessed the very high overshoot scenario of SSP5 3.4 OS. However, this high overshoot scenario is not the focus in working group 2 and working group 3. And why working group 2 refer the overshoot as exceeding a specified global warming level by more than 1.1 degrees Celsius and then return. Working group 3 define limited overshoot, exceeding warming by up to about 0.1 degrees Celsius and high overshoot by 0.1 to 0.3 degrees Celsius. So I think we need a more constant definition for the overshoot across working groups. And working group 1 community, we need to assess more overshoot scenarios, especially the 1.5 overshoot scenarios with the limited or high overshoot. And this is my last slide, summarizing some of the recommendations for AI7 based on the lessons from AI6. First, much stronger collaboration and linkages across 3 working group communities will be required for development and choices of scenarios assessed in the AI7. Second, better alignment for estimating a crossing time for a given global warming level will be required between the working group 1 and working group 3. We may be complementary each other. Third, we may need to further improve our understanding and prediction and projection of near-term climate change, especially at regional scales. In particular, better information on uncertainties from internet variability in the near term will have an important implication for global statistics. Last but not least, we also need to further improve our understanding of high-impact, low-probability outcomes, abrupt climate change, and irreversibility, which will be associated with a large impact and high risks to human and natural systems. And those issues may be better integrated with the working group 2 assessment. Okay, that's my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Junyi, and then we go on to the next presentation by Steve Rose. And if you have questions, keep them for the discussion after the 3 presentations and a comment from Claudia. So thanks again, Junyi, and over to you, Steve, please.
Great. Let me start by thanking Jan and Anna both for organizing this session and also for organizing the cross-working group discussions throughout the AR6 process. They were extremely productive conversations, and hopefully we'll share some of the insights from those conversations with you today. So I had the pleasure of being essentially sort of a facilitator or coordinator for Working Group 2 in terms of our Working Group 2 internal scenarios conversations, and I also sat on the cross-working group scenarios team and had a chance to engage in that conversation. I'm a lead author for Chapter 18 in Working Group 2, which is Climate Resilient Development Pathways, and part of my responsibilities as a lead author for that chapter were actually to engage with Working Group 1 and Working Group 3. So to really think about climate resilient development, which for those of you not familiar with that definition, it's really about thinking about how can mitigation and adaptation support sustainable development. So it's forcing you into that space to not only think about future climate change, but think about mitigation and adaptation. So I'm going to sort of first just kind of take you into a little bit of the discussion that we had within Working Group 2. So I'm going to a little bit of a different approach than what you just heard. I'm going to just give you some insights into the kind of thinking that went on with respect to considering how to potentially apply standardized socioeconomic and climate scenarios in Working Group 2. And I think that would be valuable just so you understand a little bit of the issues that were raised in that context. And the nature of the thinking that's going on in Working Group 2, which will be true for the next assessment as well. And it will also help you better understand the decisions that were made with respect to the report. So first of all, we began by sort of just an open conversation of entertaining the idea of standardized scenarios, both standardized climate as well as socioeconomic scenarios. That began with a conversation with all of the chapters and all the cross-chapter papers to really better understand just what it is they're doing, to what degree they're already thinking about scenarios, to what degree they're already thinking about some other potential indicators that could be candidates for having some standardization across the report. There's a lot of enthusiasm for thinking about it, and that's still true today. But a variety of issues and concerns came up in those conversations, and I would have to say that many of those were about the socioeconomic scenarios and the idea of standardizing those. So I'll just share a little bit of that with you. One is just trying to fully and properly represent the Working Group 2 literature. For those of you familiar with that literature, it's a disparate literature. Right? There's a lot of different kinds of analysis that occur in the context of evaluating impacts, everything from global to very local, different temporal scales, different kinds of scenario analysis at different scales as well that's going on to think about potential risks and potential adaptation strategies. So that was a key issue for our discussions. There were a variety of other issues that were raised having to do with interpretation of global storylines and how you think about applying those down to a local context. Also implementation mechanics, just trying to think about how would you try to actually connect that disparate literature to potentially global contexts. What might be one, like I said, just mechanical issues associated with just trying to make some sort of concrete connections and linking them, but also additional information and also additional uncertainties that would be introduced in that process. Some standardized scenario literature issues in general in terms of trying to capture the broader set of uncertainty that's relevant to evaluating potential risks, especially at a local scale. Thinking about endogeneity in terms of potential impacts and how they might be actually changing the trajectory of some of those scenarios, as well as some other more detailed issues. Another issue that came to light was that most of the Working Group 2 literature is not based on CMIP 6, and it's not based on CMIP 6 SSP socioeconomic combinations either. So that's important to keep in mind. So when we're talking about trying to provide climate information and connect to the Working Group 2 impacts literature, we have to take into account what projections were being used or what climate information was being used. So CMIP 5 was in play, SRES was in play, just temperature levels were being used for some of the analysis. In the case where there were RCP-SSP combinations, there really was a hybrid of bringing together a CMIP 5 climate projection with an SSP socioeconomic context. So that's just another part of the challenge with trying to use that impacts literature. And that, in some ways, that's just the nature of the sequence with which science develops and the timing with which that information can be brought on board. There was also concerns about doing new analysis versus assessment. So this is, when you're talking about trying to connect all of this different kinds of literature, you're talking about making a lot of assumptions and decisions. Those are things that are arguably analysis. and there would be alternatives to those decisions. So that's just something else to keep in mind. Part of our dialogue was not only internal, it was with the other working groups. So we had a variety of our own events where we brought in the other working groups to better understand what was developing in those working groups, to share ideas for possible ways of integrating, for possible opportunities for taking advantage of what was being developed. And I've listed some of those things there. And some of that is documented in various boxes and other places across the reports. So where did we end up? We ended up with a couple principles. One is that we really wanted to focus on facilitating. So what could we do that would facilitate cross-chapter and cross-working group communications and assessment? And to be honest, to avoid new work. Working Group 2 felt pretty overwhelmed. All the CLAs were saying we really can't take on anything entirely new. We're just trying to get our arms around our literature. So that was something else that needed to be taken into consideration. Wanted to take advantage of what was developing in the other working groups. So, for example, global warming levels coming out of Working Group 1 and all the work that's going on there. That's also still scenarios, of course, as well, but just recognizing something new which provided a new opportunity. Working Group 3 and the temperature binning of the different scenarios. So you have peak temperatures being used to define the bins for dividing up the scenario literature, and you'll hear about that in a second from Working Group 3. And also really a concern about trying to make sure that we're only communicating on what the literature supports. So not setting up an exercise that would be, in some ways, asking people to fill in the space. Right? So, well, you might have a study over here and a study over there, but you don't have anything in between. And we don't want people trying to necessarily guess. So that was a concern in Working Group 2. They didn't want to be put in an awkward position where they didn't have the literature and be trying to fill in that space. So in the end, we ended up adopting what we refer to as common climate dimensions, and we ended up not adopting common socioeconomic scenarios. So let me talk about both of those things. So common climate dimensions are exactly what the label refers to. It's having common climate-related information to essentially provide that sort of facilitation of consistency in terms of communications and facilitating assessment across the working group and as well as across the chapters. Part of that, the exercise moving forward is trying to identify what those should be, those common climate dimensions. So we actually did a survey of all the chapters and cross-chapter papers to collect more concrete information. So we had our earlier brainstorming session. This was really an opportunity for us to say, okay, tell us what you're using. What do you use to communicate in terms of climate variables, time dimensions, scenarios, global warming levels? Give us some sense of what's showing up where in terms of what's in your literature, but also what you're using now to help facilitate communications from your individual chapters. That was a useful exercise. There's a slide in here. I won't cover it, but it provided us with a lot of insights in terms of, one, the fact that there's a huge number of different variables that are being used across Working Group 2. Just within temperature alone, I think there was about 20 different temperature-related variables that were being used across Working Group 2. And also, there's a lot of disparity in terms of global warming levels, sets of global warming levels, and scenario use across the chapters. So we're in a difficult situation of trying to think about how do you sort of provide some kind of standardization in this context where you don't have any uniformity in the information that's actually there. We developed, in addition to the survey, we also wanted to develop what we refer to as a mapping resource for translating between projections and these common climate dimensions. So whatever we identified, and I'll talk about that in a second. Having a resource that will allow people, having a resource that will allow you, am I timing out on my slides? It's telling me to move forward. Can you go back one slide? Can I go back one slide? There. So having a resource that would allow us to essentially talk about CMIP-5 projections and also then talk about common climate variable, a particular variable. So when is a global warming level reached, for example, right? Likewise, being able to talk about a global warming level and say, oh, let's think about different projections in terms of when that would happen, right? So being able to move in that space between these common climate dimensions and projections, whether they be CMIP-5, CMIP-6, or the assessed climates coming out of Working Group 1, which brought in the other lines of evidence, was really important to be able to facilitate this activity of trying to have greater synthesis across the report. The other thing, just going on to the socioeconomic scenarios, so the various issues that I mentioned on the earlier slide were relevant in this context, really struggling with how we could possibly apply those in the context, given the various issues, in particular the fact that the literature isn't already based solely on socioeconomic scenarios. So there's this challenge of trying to bring all that information together and not feeling comfortable with what could potentially happen in terms of losing information about uncertainties and potential risks. That said, of course, common scenarios like shared socioeconomic pathways are part of the impacts literature. So it is represented in the report, and it shows up appropriately within the chapters where that literature is there, along with the literature that's not based on things like shared socioeconomic pathways. So I'll skip the survey slide. So what are we talking about in common climate dimensions? Pretty simple. We're focused on global warming levels, and on the levels that Working Group 1 had essentially identified as integration opportunities. So 1.5, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, and 4 degrees. That said, you'll see that in Working Group 2, there are results reported at different global warming levels. That's simply because we're using projections to try to get to global warming levels. They don't line up with these 4 bins, right? So we end up sometimes with 2.3 and things like that. So that's just something you'll see. We also tried to standardize on the projection time periods so that we were aligned with the projection periods that Working Group 1 was using and also aligned with the years that Working Group 3 was using to talk about potential futures at different points in time. We also were wanting to use the other climate variables off of global warming levels. So if you think about a particular global warming level, what sort of ranges of potential outcomes do we get for other variables like extreme temperatures and extreme precipitation conditions. So that was a way to kind of connect to the global warming level, bring in some uncertainty about potential climates and potential hazards, and then explore potential risks off of that. We've developed this mapping resource, and actually many of the tables that are here are part of that mapping resource to help people move between global warming levels and climate projections as well as other variables besides global warming levels. And you can see it includes CMIP 5, CMIP 6, as well as assessed ranges from Working Group 1. And the point was really to provide good context, right? So this is all appears in Chapter 1, and it's meant to sort of set up the rest of the report and say, look, when we're talking about particular projections or particular temperatures, you can look at this as a resource to sort of figure out how to be in that space. You can think about sort of what some of the uncertainty associated with moving off of a global warming level and think about climates in a particular region and so on. And there's also mapping resources that appear within Working Group 2. Just a couple quick examples. I'm not going to talk through the details here. You all know burning embers figures like the one on the left. There you see a combination of projections, right, to the left of that burning ember, and you see global warming levels that are essentially in the burning ember, right? So that's one way that these two pieces of information come together. Right? You have a projection for a sequence of global warming levels, and then you have particular risks at particular points of global warming level. On the right-hand side are just some other examples where now you have some spatial heterogeneity for different global warming levels, and you'll see they don't line up at those 4 levels. There's a variety of different levels because we're actually translating the projections into global warming levels. But it's a way to sort of provide that uniformity in terms of having that global warming level as a way to anchor some of the information for a variety of different impacts. Connecting to Working Group 3 was also something that we did within the context of climate resilient development. So thinking about the different Working Group 3 bins in terms of peak temperatures. I'm going to try to read the chart, but I'll just describe what's there. So what it's showing you is different sustainable development indicator outcomes for peak temperatures using the Working Group 3 database. So thanks, Ed. Ed and I worked together a lot in terms of making sure I was staying up to date with what was happening in terms of the scenario data there. But that was a way for us to bring in a sustainable development story on the mitigation side while we were also bringing in a sustainable development story on the impacts and adaptation side. So just a few sort of things to facilitate the discussion today. What are our opportunities going forward? So based on the experience we had, I see a lot of opportunities. So coordination, and it was great that you brought up that as well. I think there's a real opportunity for earlier and sustained coordination. So some of the conversations we were having in Working Group 2, I would say happens later than would be desirable. But that was just the way it unfolded. So having some of those conversations, even prior to the first lead author meeting, is really valuable to kind of get people thinking, just get the wheels turning. One obstacle I'll just call out for Jim and for other co-chairs of the future, right, is the timing of the reports. It makes it hard to take advantage of the information coming out of the other reports. Working Group 1's Interactive Atlas is an amazing resource. We didn't really get to take advantage of it because by the time it had stabilized and we were able to kind of really see what was there, we were already pretty far along and things were pretty well baked. Working Group 3, likewise, we're trying to kind of bring together this climate resilient development story and bring in the mitigation information. And it was literally real time. Ed had the scenarios change this week. Ed, it was just like we're trying to just kind of keep up with what's happening with the scenario data, trying to figure out how to use it, trying to keep track of what's happening in terms of the conclusions coming out of Working Group 3 in the different chapters, so as make sure that we're not getting out of line with them. So that's just a coordination is a clear opportunity from my point of view. The common climate dimensions, I think, is actually a pretty useful way to think about things. I'm not suggesting we put projections aside. It's not an alternative projections, but I think it's a really useful way to kind of provide this way of kind of tying things down on climate. And then we can explore uncertainties off of that, right? So we can explore uncertainties in the hazard, like I was talking about, if you're using global warming levels. We can explore uncertainty and exposure and vulnerability and adaptation, right, off of those potential climates too. So it's an opportunity to really get into more risk assessments and risk management, I think. So did you see that there's some possibilities there? The climate translation resource, I feel like we only scraped the surface with that, and I think it's something that's needed by the community, not just for the next assessment report. There clearly is a need for people producing different papers to connect to a common way of thinking about the climate. So the kind of thing we built, I think, is promising in that regard, and maybe I think that's probably more of a research community activity than an IPCC activity. New scenarios, you just heard a discussion of overshoots and plausibility or feasibility. Extremely important issues, right, as we think about sort of where we're headed in terms of the future climate, and trying to think about managing those risks and identifying them. Transitions in climate resilient development, you also heard sort of like, interest and need for focusing on the near term, right? So near term in terms of whatever term you want to use to think about the near term, transitions or climate resilient development or sustainable development, it's all near term, right? We're all talking about the next few decades. And that means sort of, can we do better in terms of climate and characterizing that uncertainty? Can we do better in terms of socioeconomic uncertainty, which represents the risk in terms of who's exposed and vulnerable? And then last on socioeconomic scenarios, I just think there's more discussion needed, right? So we have an opportunity with the standardized scenarios, right? And I think a lot of us here all kind of sort of see that as an opportunity. But I do think that there's some limitations there. One limitation I'll just call out is that there are a lot of different futures we're finding consistent with any climate. So when you sort of get down to sub-global uncertainty, you're trying to talk about a country or a region of a country, you have to think about a lot more than what's represented in sort of that aggregate picture to really begin to think about the risks that are there and the opportunities for managing that risk. And I also think there's alternatives to potentially provide the full extent of the information. Right? Can we contextualize? So if we have impact ranges for example, global warming levels, what about talking about what defines the high and low ends of those ranges in terms of things that impact exposure, vulnerability, and adaptation strategies? So, thank you very much.
And now we have a presentation by three authors, Kevan, Ria, Roberto Chapter, and Ed Byers. So Kevan will do the presentation, and over to you, Kevan.
Yeah, thank you for having us. Basically, this is the team of Chapter 3. So Roberto and I were the CLAs, the convening lead authors of Chapter 3, and Ed was the chapter scientist. And I see actually a few other authors from the chapter as well. So we would give a presentation basically a little bit about the scenario assessment process in Working Group 3, and then a few observations perhaps about the process and some recommendations for the next assessment cycle, basically AR7. So in general, I think this was really a 3-year collaborative journey with a quite unprecedented effort in terms of scenario collection that has been happening by the Working Group 3 community. So in total, more than 3,000 scenarios were collected. Thank you, Ed. Perhaps could you display the slides? I can see them here actually. I hope I didn't press the wrong button. Okay.
usually shaking the table helps. Should I do without? Yeah, so perhaps I can describe a little bit the overall effort itself. So we managed to collect basically more than 3,000 scenarios, and what was new really is that we had lots of new modeling teams joining, so 188 different modeling teams, and 188 models actually for 50 plus different modeling teams, which provided information and scenarios that we could assess in the database. It's there? Okay. So basically, how did the process look like? We collected the information in a database and provided that to, basically it was available as a resource for the whole writing team. A lot of effort went actually into the vetting of the scenarios. We have a very rapidly changing policy environment, new technologies coming online. Scenarios need to be calibrated and vetted, and it is an enormous process and effort by the writing team to take 3,000 scenarios and evaluate all of them and narrow them down to 1,200 scenarios, which we thought reflect, first of all, the current trends well, and second of all, provide sufficient information at the global level to make an assessment of the climate consequences of those scenarios. And for the assessment of the climate consequences, it was particularly important that we had a really great handshake with Working Group 1. There was very intense collaboration between the two working groups. Emulators were provided, which were calibrated to the newest information in AR6. And I consider this as one of the real major improvements that we could, in the assessment, basically use up-to-date climate information. We did not only collect those scenarios, we had also a separate process where the writing team actually came together and looked at the different mitigation strategies that are possible in order to limit temperature change to 1.5 and 2 degrees. And then jointly together, we selected 5 different archetypes of those scenarios, different basically mitigation strategies in the future, and called them the illustrative mitigation pathways. So that was an iterative process within the whole writing team, with basically selecting first more, and then we decided to narrow the choices down and had at the end 5 different illustrative mitigation scenarios and 2 scenarios basically illustrative of current policies or relatively modest actions that complemented the full scenarios in a database, and which basically provided the basis for the assessment in Working Group 3. How did we use the scenarios? So basically the scenarios at the one hand, but at the other hand also bottom-up information, sectoral information together describe basically the solution space and the options that are available in order to basically reduce emissions to the degree necessary to stay below certain warming levels. The scenarios were also used to illustrate the timing of those changes, what emissions reductions are needed, to which extent overshoot might be part of the story, and what it takes to bring back temperatures after the overshoot. What are major system characteristics? How quickly do we need to upscale certain mitigation options? What demand-side changes are necessary? For the very first time, the report concludes also that, for example, carbon dioxide removal is necessary for a net zero emission system, and together with the sectoral colleagues, we looked also into sectoral contribution in an integrated system. Also net zero CO2 and net zero GHG timing and the balance between different sectors was a focus of the assessment, implications of the delayed mitigation, mitigation costs, feasibility challenges that might be associated with different pathways, as well as important policy gaps. So investments, but also basically emissions gaps. If you compare current emissions outcomes in 2030 and emissions outcomes from the scenarios that are consistent with 1.5 and 2 degrees. So some improvements in this process that one could highlight, and I mentioned them just earlier, is the complementary use of a big scenario database, including selected illustrative mitigation pathways and the space of socioeconomic uncertainties, which is depicted by the SSBs. They gave us basically the possibility to use horses for courses. For some things we used illustrative mitigation pathways, for other things statistics from the database, and sometimes we relied also on the SSBs. I think the extension from global scenarios to a much wider collection of national, regional and sectoral scenarios was also very important because it improved our understanding of differences between the integrated IEM scenarios and the individual sectoral scenarios. And then I would say important was also in this context the collaboration between chapters 3 and chapter 4. Basically, one chapter that very much focused on the near term, on regional solutions and global solutions, so that we could inform also with the pathways the NDC assessment. And then finally, I think it's important to note that in the scenario database, more than half of all the chapters at the end were able to use the scenarios throughout the report. However, I agree with Jim's observation at the beginning that the timing was here really critical. And because some of the information and the vetting was made available relatively late, I think we could have had much more scenario representation throughout the report if results would have been made available earlier, and we would have closed the doors on some of the improvements earlier in the process. So I mentioned this earlier, but I wanted to perhaps highlight it also with an own slide. I think the handshake between Working Group 1 and Working Group 3 was really exceptional. So we could go beyond early assessment and achieve full consistency of the climate outcomes, and this was made possible basically by a number of institutions very heavily involved, particularly those who at the end also developed the emulators at the Working Group 1 side. So we used 3 different emulators with MAGIC, the Cicero model, but also the FAIR model from the Leeds University, and I think achieved quite some consistency and coherence and also integration. Issues like carbon budget consistency was not there anymore, which was an issue in AR5. The role of non-CO2 was much clearer. And all of that is available also as an open source workflow. And the collaboration that we have within AR6 can help the community also in the future if you have new scenarios to run them also to the same emulators, and to that also has a long-lasting impact on the community itself. In terms of handshake, perhaps with Working Group 2 and Working Group 3, as Hans Otto also in the morning explained, in Working Group 3 and Steve explained, scenarios played only a relatively smaller role. Although at the same time, if you look at the literature on the SSPs, 2019, 50% on the SSP literature was an impact. In the meantime, there's actually more impact literature on the SSPs than the mitigation. So that's an emerging literature that can be taken up perhaps in the
in the next assessment, in the AR7 cycle. The main focus on the collaboration, nevertheless, which I think a really remarkable outcome, was also on the cost and benefit of avoided impacts and mitigation. And for the very first time in an IPCC report, actually, we have an SBM statement which clearly states that the economic benefits of the avoided impact of the 2 degrees are basically larger in order of magnitudes compared to the economic costs of mitigation. That's something that I don't see Celine here, I saw her today here, has been coordinating from our side, Celine Gouvarache. And I think also, I think it's an important conclusion because it shows how powerful messages that come out from a collaboration between Working Group 2 and Working Group 3 can be. I think now looking a little bit into the future, so there's a lot of potential to think about new scenario methodologies that would help us to better integrate impact, adaptation, and mitigation in the AR7 across the different communities. I think the focus on individual warming levels is great as a current integrating device, right? So you look at warming levels, what does it take in terms of mitigation to stay below that warming level? Working Group 2 says, okay, that are the impacts at that warming level, and Working Group 1 assesses the emissions that are consistent with that warming level. But in reality, our assessment has become more complex. So we are discussing overshoot and bringing temperatures back. The path that leads to that temperature is extremely important. Whether we cross the same temperature in 2030 or in 2050 might mean completely different vulnerabilities and adaptive capacities. And I think therefore it is necessary that we think about methods how we can achieve this integration in a perhaps more in an improved way. At the one hand, I think the integrated assessment models include more and more impacts, so the process-based integrated assessment models, and we could think about providing the community with SSPs with and without impacts. So far, it was a choice based on community discussions that we develop mitigation scenarios for the SSPs without impacts, because that would be the best counterfactual and starting point for the impacts community to add the impacts and look at the implications of impacts in those different worlds. But there are, because of the progress in science, I think there are other possibilities to bring impacts and to integrate them better into the scenarios as well. For example, post-processing of existing scenarios using similar impacts emulators as those that we are using for climate emulators is one possibility. This could be ranging from aggregated impact functions that we know from the literature. This could be local extremes and downscaling devices that basically, like the Messemer model, which is developed at ETH Zurich for the integration of those impacts. And we could also use combined socioeconomic vulnerability and extreme downscaling and an overlay and the socioeconomic, basically vulnerability downscaling with an overlay on the extremes to better understand who is exposed and how big is the risk into the future. And I think we could more and more make this a standard device for, like the climate emulators to connect between our communities. Some areas of improvement and challenges for AR7. I was wondering a little bit when I looked to the three reports, when I looked to the scenario nomenclature, whether sometimes we are a little bit confusing also our users and recipients. So we started out with the shared socioeconomic pathways framing, and from those we selected the so-called illustrative pathways in Working Group 1. In parallel, we had a development in Working Group
SF22, which looked into climate resilient development pathways. At the same time, we selected also illustrative mitigation scenarios in working group 3 and married them with the concept of shifting development pathways. And there was a government delegate 2 weeks ago when we were actually in Bonn who came to me, Kevan, can you please give me the context between the illustrative pathway, the illustrative mitigation pathway, and the shifting development pathway? I think I could do it, but it was not an elevator speech in 5 minutes. So I think we need perhaps better coordination also in nomenclature and how those different scenario concepts relate to each other. I think another challenge in AR6 was that we have a lot of focus on central trends. So Jim showed that 90% of all scenarios are SSP2 based, and we have a discussion about the plausibility of high scenarios and the feasibility of the low scenarios that I think need to be addressed in a systematic way in AR7. We have also the challenge that the scenario shelf times become lower and lower. So we have scenario cycles, which are 7 years, but we know that a lot of new policies are coming online every year. Technology trends are very fast. How can we accelerate or how can we adapt so that we have scenarios that are available which are consistent with those new recent trends is a big challenge that we need to address, I think, in AR7, perhaps a little bit better in terms of the process so that we don't run into similar challenges. Equity dimension was mentioned, and bringing this better into the scenarios will be critical. And then extending the SSPs to narratives, but also include new concepts and trends such as just transitions, the role of digitalization, narratives about how CDR, carbon dioxide removal, will become part of the system. I think many different other things need to be part of the framework as well. That's my last slide. Am I running over time? Probably. Yeah, but okay. So my last slide, I'm very quick on this. Recommendations for AR7, I think thinking pragmatically and noting also the major challenge for maintaining the infrastructure and organizing a scenario and vetting and collection process during the AR6. This was very demanding to do exactly in parallel to the rest of the assessment work. So I think it will be really important at this time we are prepared before the AR7 with a regular activity of collection and vetting so that we just have to do incremental updates in the AR7 and don't have all the work at the same time, because I think that's really becoming a big challenge. So a standing group which does regular annual vetting, standardized downscaling, perhaps already noting the needs of working group 2 in terms of what sort of downscaling needs to happen for vulnerability and impact, and basically helps us to foster also a common understanding of what sort of scenario assessment is most useful for working group 2. I want to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevan. And again, thanks to all the presenters. I think these presentations were really nice follow-ups of what we heard in the plenary today. So I ask all the presenters and the co-authors of the presentations to come up and sit here in the panel. And now Claudia Tebaldi from Working Group 1, lead author in Working Group 1, will give a brief comment on what we've heard and also to inspire the further discussion. So over to you, Claudia.
Thank you. I was asked to give provocative comments, and I'm not going to do that. The only provocative thing I'll say is that we're really bad at staying within 10 minutes when we... But anyway, rather than being provocative, I want to, first of all, acknowledge the amazing amount of work
and effort that go into these assessment reports. I was at a session earlier and somebody was showing a graph of the increase in literature, and I think it showed that in 2020 the amount of papers published that are relevant to the IPCC report assessment, the number is the same as the total papers that were published that would have sustained up to the third assessment report. So it's becoming really an amazing effort, and maybe the provocative thing here is to ask, is it sustainable without AI, which was the theme of the session, the presentation. Anyway, I'll keep it very brief. I give you my desire for when I step out of this session would be to have a better understanding of the relative importance and maybe the prioritization of these three dimensions that I think came out of all the presentations that kind of make up this problem of integration across working groups using scenarios. And the first dimension is just simple logistics, right? The timing of the reports, maybe the need for institutional memory so that the next phase doesn't start from scratch after all the work that has been done to come to this point. This would, of course, facilitate working group 2 in catching up, but also, avoid, for example, misinterpretation of the scenario when the working group 1 report comes up first and the scenarios are interpreted for much more than what the working group 1 can talk about. The second dimension is what I call the top-down issue, how much of this could be ameliorated by some kind of leadership from the very beginning, stepping up and saying, this is how we're going to do the things, and so prioritizing, scenarios more. I was struck by Paula's presentation this morning that mentioned that IPBES has scenarios built into its structure and its leadership, so could IPCC do that as well? I don't know. And the third dimension is instead the bottom-up, which is how much of this could be ameliorated by the community, the scientific community working differently and providing